BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And for today's turning point, I want to do a rant just on my own. Rants are not only fun and good for the blood pressure, they also give me the opportunity to explore a few things that I can't readily explore so much with guests, and to lay out a few ideas for you to comment on, to react to, or just to think about. And today I want to talk about the future of Europe, the future of a peaceful and good Europe, a Europe that might exist in a generation or so. And for those of you that are listening or watching from outside of Europe, believe me, this is of interest to all of us, because not only does Europe's political future have an important impact on what's happening in other parts of the world, but also I want to argue that if Europe has anything to defend, any future to go towards, it's because it offers a political model, a model of societies that are still more open than in many other places in the world, that is also of importance for a global community. So I do think that Europe's future is of interest to all people who wish to live in relatively free, relatively democratic societies. Things are never perfect, but things are getting a lot more imperfect in many places of the world, including in Europe, and that brings me to my subject. It's a funny thing to be a European these days, because until 20 years ago or so, many European leaders, intellectuals, politicians thought that Europe had finally sorted it out. It had found the answer to everything. It had wealthy, democratic, liberal societies that cared about human rights, and it had left behind the nasty world of wars and violence and political violence. It had found a better way of doing things, and this way was liberal, this way was democratic, this way was market-based. And when you talk to liberal Europeans, you often had the impression that they thought, well, you know, the rest of the world, it's really a shame that they're not more like us, because they could do that so easily, and then the world would be a perfect place. But we just have to wait until people wake up to the fact that they could be and should be more like us. This builds on Francis Fukuyama's idea of the end of history after 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent crumbling of the Soviet Empire, that gave the impression that here was a great ideological battle lost between communism and capitalism capitalism had simply won. It was the better system, and therefore now this was the end of history in terms of the end of the struggle of ideologies, the end of ideological wars, and from now on the world will be a much more pragmatic place, but most problems would be resolved. Well, as we all know, it hasn't come like that. Things have developed very differently. Democracies have not begun an inexorable rise across the world, but on the contrary, at the moment they're being pushed back and places are becoming less democratic, autocracies on the rise. And so here's the question, not only what went wrong, but also what might be a way out. And I think to understand that, we first have to understand how we got in the situation that we are in, and how this lovely holiday from history that Europe has enjoyed between, say, 1945 and 2000s has turned so terribly sour, and history has returned in all its brutality, with wholesale slaughter in Gaza, with an attack on Ukraine and a war that is still raging there, with other conflicts, and especially also that is significant for Europe, not only for its self-image, but also for its future, a breakdown in the European-US relations Of course, they are still ongoing, but basically the implicit guarantee of NATO, the famous Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, that has become very much conditional on how Mr. Trump feels that morning and what he's had for breakfast. And that has made many Europeans wake up and think, well, that's not really good enough. But these are not Europe's only severe problems. The economic model is creaking, the social model is creaking, our democracies are under enormous strain. And there are strategic problems with energy supply, because Europe can generate far too little of its own energy, with supply of natural resources and strategic resources such as rare earths, which Europe doesn't seem to be able to generate of its own. And then there's perhaps also underlying trends that are very important, such as migration and demographic change, because Europe is simply a continent that is not only getting older, but also beginning to die out. We are having far too few children to sustain the levels of population that we have at the moment. And, well, that changes things for countries, not only in Europe, of course. You only need to look at China, at Japan, or at Korea, which is, I think, the most extreme example of underpopulation at the moment. Europeans feel slightly surprised by this development. As I said, they think they have solved the problem, so why are they now coming back? And I think if you want to know why they're coming back, you only need to see why we live in these relatively peaceful, relatively free societies that haven't had a war for so long, thanks mainly to the EU and also to the experience of 2 world wars. So why do we live in these societies? And that's just not because Europe has had better management and better values and better moral values, but simply also because Europe has profited from centuries of colonialism and slavery, and of course also the subjugation of its own working populations in the early industrial revolution. And yes, that has accumulated a lot of wealth, and no, that is not a model that we can easily carry or should carry into the 21st century. So once you look at this part of the story, you see why this motor is no longer going. And this motor, of course, of economic growth continued after the Second World War, because first of all, after two world wars, the economies were exhausted. Many of the countries were partially destroyed. The industry was partially destroyed. And so there was a lot to reconstruct, also with American aid through the Marshall Plan after the war. And therefore, of course, yes, there was a big uptick. There was great economic growth. And that coincided with fossil fuels coming online and really giving this a jolt of development and growth. And Europe swam on this, and there were the 2 famous democratic promises that Europeans were made. And the first one was, if you work hard, if you apply yourself, then you too can climb the social ladder. You can buy perhaps a washing machine, a car, or even a little house. You know, there is a path for you to partake in the growth of wealth. And the other thing was, your children will live better than you did, so there is a positive future ahead. Both of these promises have dramatically collapsed, and that has very serious repercussions for our democracy, because if people no longer see that their own interests are to be identified with the system they live in, then why would they support that system? So if you want to see an example of that, you only need to look at the German economy and at Germany, because Germany has run a model over the last decades that was very successful and made the country very wealthy. But that was basically based on cheap energy from Russia and a huge market in China and security from the United States. It was based on a very creative way of outsourcing that brought this country everything it needed. But now all of these 3 pillars have collapsed. And, well, it shows you also perhaps the dangers of outsourcing, because it reduces your own capacity to produce things that you may need, even if you can't do that at the scale that the outsourcing or with the convenience that the outsourcing allows you. But if this is on a scale of national economies, of course, that's not only an economic problem, but it becomes a political problem. And we're at the moment living with this political problem. So the question is, we're living in a country, in a continent, on a continent that is suffering many serious problems at the moment. A continent whose entire model is called into question. And the question is, can this continent turn itself around? Can it provide a counterweight to other powers? Because that has very much become the issue. The European model, with an EU, with soft power, with largely economic power and a reduction of military power, function not only because of the security guarantees of the US, but also because of a general rules-based order in which international institutions were relatively respected and international arbitration was respected, and therefore a loose confederation that was very bureaucracy heavy, but also quite effective in its way, like the EU, could exist in this rules-based context. That has changed. That has changed with Trump. That has changed with the war in Ukraine. That has changed with the rise of China. And that means that we're now living in a world that is much more like the 19th century, a neo-imperial world in which these three empires and some rivaling forces that are knocking on that door of being in the big imperial league are carving up the world between themselves. And it is no longer a question of rules and negotiations, but it is often a question of brute force. Who rules what? And in this order, as has often been pointed out, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And for Europe at the moment, it's a very simple choice whether it wants to have a seat at the table and therefore be able to some degree decide its own fate and its own future, or whether it will be on the menu and simply be carved up between the bigger powers and be in a state of dependency. Or you can also say, with nice historical irony, the continent of the colonizers is becoming a colonized continent. But let's just take it step by step and see how this works out. If Europe wants to have a future in which Europeans are able to decide, to some extent at least, their own future, I think three things are very important, and three things are really not negotiable. There needs to be a degree of strategic autonomy so that these decisions can be made at all. European industries need to be sustainable, because if the climate crisis overwhelms our economies and our political systems, there will be no more good governance and there will be much more violence and war in the world. And these countries, or this federation, needs to be a democratic one that respects human rights, because otherwise the two other things are completely pointless. If Europe descends into a set of autocracies, they don't need to be European autocracies. The important thing about Europe is that it offers a political alternative, an ideological alternative, an alternative way of living that other countries may also want, but that the Europeans, or a majority of Europeans, still certainly want. So let's have a look at these 3 points very quickly and see where things are going in this regard. And first of all, we come to autonomy. And autonomy at the moment, unfortunately, means partially rearmament. Europe is not in state to defend itself against an aggressor like Russia, and Russia is already at war with Europe. At the moment, this is a so-called hybrid war, low-level, deniable kind of war, where they use disposable agents they find on the internet and they give them a little bit of money to conduct acts of sabotage. But there's also whole troll armies to disinform and misinform people, to influence elections. There's also election interference from the United States in the form of favoring particular autocratic right-wing parties, financing of these parties. And yes, there's also direct sabotage, and there are even political murders. All of this is happening already. There are cyber attacks almost daily. So Europe is already a continent under threat. It's already a continent that's being directly attacked, and it needs to be able to defend itself, because if it can't, then none of the rest will happen. But you don't need to look at a military aggressor like Russia to see that Europe is, in fact, not living up to this promise, not living up to this hope. Only look at the world of the digital revolution that we're at the moment experiencing in the workplace, in the economy, but also in our private lives. And here you have to say very clearly that Europe is on the path to becoming a colony. It is on the path to becoming a colony because it doesn't control any of these technologies. Europe doesn't have a viable large language model, not a commercially viable one. And there is Mistral, a French project, but that receives so much less funding than American projects, that models of a similar kind, that it simply can't compete. There are, of course, other models also, but they're even more grossly underfunded. And then when it comes to, for instance, cloud storage, you find that, yes, there are European cloud solutions, but they're simply not being used on a large scale. And for instance, 70% of European government data are in fact on American servers. And one executive order from the president could mean that European governments could no longer access their own data. The list goes on. It goes on to other software. It goes on to other digital solutions, all of which are controlled from the United States or from China, none of which are controlled within Europe. This also is true, of course, for social media and for the algorithms that control these social media. As you know, social media are made to keep us involved and therefore to keep us emotionalized, because that's the best way of keeping us online for longer, to maximize the time we spend on these things, the time we are generating data about our private lives, that time that we are targets for advertising, etc. Now, a different kind of social media could have different algorithms, but for that, the interests behind it would have to be different, namely not maximizing profit, but perhaps maximizing a different kind of profit, a social profit, for instance. So there would be a quite simple idea that has been floating around for a while, which is a European digital commons in which these technologies could be held and could be used in the public interest. But this is very far away. It doesn't only cost an enormous amount of money. There's also a whole thicket of laws and, of course, of very powerful lobbies that make that very hard. And then, only then, do we come to the consumers and whether they do or do not want to actually accept that. So here you see that Europe is already on the way to being a licensee, a customer of other powers, and will have to use technologies that are not designed in order to keep European democracies flourishing, but designed to give power and money to other interests. Let's come to another subject which has to do with autonomy and security, and that is borders. And here we come to the very thorny problem of migration, and I don't want to delve into that. Perhaps I'll do another podcast about that, just as about the digital revolution in future. But let's just keep things very simple here and say, yes, there are huge problems associated with migration, and no, Europe cannot take in everyone who wants or needs to come, because neither the social systems nor the societies nor the economies could support that. And of course, yes, Europe must also be able, European countries must be able to decide who lives within their borders. and to police those borders and to plan the societies accordingly. You need to know how many kids need to go to school and how many people need hospital services in order to plan a social system, for instance. But on the other hand, there are humanitarian responsibilities. There are entanglements and economic involvements that create misery abroad, and therefore Europeans can't say that this has got nothing to do with them. And there is the fact that European populations are shrinking and aging, and there are pensions to be paid for Europeans who live now. And that if we want that these societies continue to thrive and that the economic and social systems don't simply tear apart through an aging society and shrinking society, then we need much more migration than we have at the moment. And that means that European societies will change. They will change very radically. And the question is just how we form this change, how we give shape to this change, because that's always the fact with transformation. It's a bit like getting older. You can't decide, oh, I've got my ideal age, thanks very much, I'll keep this age. You're getting older, and you can either shape this change or you can suffer this change. And I think Europe's situation, or indeed the world's situation at the moment, is very much like that. A huge transformation is upon us, and we can either suffer it or we can try to give it shape ourselves. A democratic Europe must be able to defend itself. A democratic Europe must be able to control its own resources. A democratic Europe must be able to exist in a largely hostile environment. I do not think any single European country is big enough in terms of its economy, its military, its intelligence, etc., to withstand these pressures from outside on its own. I think European countries will be flipped one by one and become sort of satellite states of dictatorships or dictatorships themselves. I do think that the only way forward would be in a strong European federation with a strong democratic legitimacy. That means a directly elected parliament, and that means a government that can say yes and no. That means also support by a working military, one fiscal system, and of course also financial markets that support that. Did you know, for instance, that Europe has more startups than the US, and many great ideas are being generated here, but when the people who do that, the startup funders, want to scale up these ideas to a commercial level, they don't get the access to enough money in Europe, so they have to go to the United States. And at this crucial point, they are lost for Europe. So again, something like one investment market, one financial market would be a crucial element of that. And also, of course, one social system. So these are entirely utopian thoughts. I don't think there's at the moment much chance of this happening, but I do think that if Europe wanted to continue its model into the 21st century, that would be a very important element of that. Sustainability is another key issue here. That brings us to the second big issue. And sustainability in the past has been portrayed as what middle-class kids use to annoy their parents by telling them they can no longer eat meat or take planes or use cars or do anything else that's fun. But I think people have understood, or many people have understood by now, that sustainability is something very different and something much more important. And I think before the backdrop of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's also become something that is of strategic significance. Europe is not able to determine its own fate, for instance, if it can't control its own energy supplies, at least largely, if it's dependent on fossil fuels that have to come from outside. And so sustainability, circularity in the economy become tremendously important for a continent that has too few resources, too little energy to supply itself. And every bit of solar power and every windmill that goes up is a contribution to Europe's strategic autonomy. And of course, there is, again, a ton of difficulties associated to that. There's lobbying, there's short-term and long-term interests that clash. And there is a whole wealth of other problems that also demand attention and resources and money. And it seems that sustainability is the last on the list at the moment, but it is still an absolutely crucial plank for any kind of positive European future. And then we come to another question, which is democracy, which is why our democracies are declining, why it seems that Europe at the moment is also abolishing itself from the inside. Now, this is a more political question, and here perhaps we have to also look more at value judgments than simply at economic numbers. Because, well, let me take the thought of someone who doesn't come from necessarily my political family. He was a conservative Christian, but he was also a very clever man. His name was Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde, a beautifully German name, and you may have heard me quote him in one or two other episodes of this podcast, because I find this sentence terribly important. And I think it tells us a lot about what's going on at the moment, although it was already written in 1962. And Böckenförde wrote then in an essay that the liberal secular state relies on assumptions that it cannot guarantee itself. The liberal secular state relies on assumptions that it cannot guarantee itself. What are these assumptions? Well, these assumptions, I think, are a fundamental respect for one another, tolerance, relying on the fact that, trust to some extent, relying on the fact that other people will basically abide by arrangements. For instance, that if you vote someone into office, that person will vacate his job or her job after the allotted time, 4 or 5 years, and will not use that time to change the laws so that he will no longer have to go. And that requires trust. So if you don't trust people to fulfill their part of the bargain, then it becomes very difficult to have democratic rule, and it becomes very difficult to have any kind of consensus in a society, and then violence will have to take over. And let's just stop a moment at this, because I think there's a useful way of thinking about this, which is game theory. Democracies are basically a game. The democratic system and the laws give you the rules of the game, and the players are the citizens. And they play this game more or less whether they want to or not. But most people seem to identify their own interests with playing this game. And you play a game because it's fun, or you play a game because you have to and you see that it's useful, such as traffic rules. You have to drive on one side of the road and you have to stop at a red light, not because you think it's particularly fun, but because, otherwise terrible accidents will happen. Or you play a game because you think better play according to these rules than according to somebody else's rules, because some game will have to be played. And, people are quite tolerant with playing this game and following the rules, or at least following the rules sufficiently often for the game to continue. The question is, what happens when people no longer think this is a game for them? I've done a little experiment on myself, and that's been very interesting. I've played a video game for a while, FIFA, the football game, and I wanted to see, first of all, how does a game like this work? I'm just the generation that has missed a great wave of gaming. But also, what does it do with me? And I found out first of all, I am a lot more ambitious to win football contests than I thought I would be. I really don't care about football, but once you're in, you really want to win. But then also, if to get credits, to get on in the game, they make you do really rather tedious tasks every day. to win these credits and then perhaps get better players or upgrades or stuff. And you do that because, after all, you want to get ahead, and you log in and you don't really feel like it, but you do your little things, and you do that every day. And that is because psychologists have found that if they bind people with meaningless little tasks every day, that binds them to the game. I mean, you only need to look at any organized religion to see how that works. You need regular ritual to keep in the game. None of this made me delete the game because, it was tedious, but it was part of it. What made me delete the game in the end was that I found that the game constantly had its digital thumb on the scales. It constantly influenced outcomes, and I could never get a fair deal. I could never get a fair return for my investment of time and money and effort and whatever else I invested in this. I felt manipulated. I felt this wasn't fair. And so I deleted the game. I think for a lot of people, citizens, democracy is rather like playing FIFA. And they're willing to do the tedious little tasks that it takes to be a citizen in a democracy, but they're not willing to play if they feel the game is stacked against them. And now you might say that is a conspiracy idea, that the game is stacked against and that them up there are doing everything and allowing themselves everything, living a different life, and we down there, we are not part of this. But actually, there are pretty robust numbers to back that idea up, to back that perception up. Social inequality in Europe has risen to a pretty shocking degree when you're looking at the numbers. First of all, there is the wonderful graph that shows you how wages and salaries have progressed and how the profits from productivity have progressed. And you see that from 1945 to 1980, they go in lockstep. So when industry produces more and profits become bigger, people also make more money. And from them, the wages and salaries flatline, but the profits continue to soar. And this whole triangle, that has gone into the pockets of about 10% of the population. If you want to look at that in numbers, you see that in the 1960s, a CEO of a big company earned about 60 times of what his average employees earned. That's a lot. That's a lot more. But it has now risen to about 700 times. Before the Second World War, the richest 10% of society earned about 25% of the total wealth and resources. Now the richest 10% earn 60% of the society's resources in Europe, and the richest 1% still earns 40% of these resources, while the bottom 50% of the population share 5% of the resources. So basically, they've got nothing saved, they've got nothing spare, they live from day to day or from month to month. Now, when you see that the idea that this game is stacked against most people is not all that wrong. The numbers seem to indicate that. And also, if you can buy yourself an American president for $280 million, or if you can buy yourself an entire state, as the Czech Prime Minister has just done, who's also a billionaire, then the idea of one person, one vote, which is at the bottom of any democracy, is simply a mockery. It's simply stupid to assume that. It is obviously not true. There are rich people who can finance think tanks and foundations, and who can put their money in trusts, and who can finance vast institutions, and who can finance lobbying and parties. And there are poorer people or average people who simply can't do that. So obviously the democracy is very strongly skewed. I believe that means that if European democracies want to remain democracies, we have to look at very large-scale redistribution of these goods. And then, of course, we come also into the digital revolution, in which I think we have to expect many people will be either losing their jobs or at least having much less work and be less able to pay their way from their income. And then we have to look at what happens with a basic social income, or which other models would be available to make up for that shortfall, in view of the fact that, of course, the profits are still being made, but they're no longer made by people. They're now made by engines and machines. There is another reason why Europeans are turning away from democracy, and that's much more contested. That's a much more critical way of looking at things, but I think it's not unimportant. And that has to do with the progressive revolution and triumph in Western countries, at least culturally. People say that the right wing has won the economic war, but the left wing has won the cultural war, and you may look at it as you want. But it is certainly true that, especially in Western Europe, the 1968 revolution was a very powerful thing. It really wasn't in Eastern Europe at all. And the 1968 revolution, which was a revolution of values, a revolution of students, yes, that took part at university. And these new progressive liberal values, the sexual revolution, and then also the feminist revolution and other civic revolutionary movements, human rights movement, where did they come from? Where did they happen? Well, they happened largely at universities. They didn't happen in factories. They didn't happen in the countryside. And the people who were at universities were part of these movements. Well, they were the people who became newspaper editors, who went into the media, who went into parliament, who taught at university, etc. They were in a position to institutionalize these ideas and to make them law. Now, I happen to I happen to share these ideas, not to change them. I happen to share them. But the fact is, it was a revolution that was very fast and very top down, and that left a lot of the population out, did not consult them, and expected this value change to go very quickly in a world that was changing in its entirety. I mean, in Europe, it was the aftermath of the Second World War. It was the next great wave of industrialization, and people's world changed in every way. The material world they were living in changed in every way. The social world that they were living in changed in every way. Now also the world of ideas they were confronted with was changed in very fundamental ways. And I think that was a very fast revolution that didn't take a lot of people with them. And for a lot of people, the result of it was that the ideas that had made their parents decent people, a love of country, perhaps religion, perhaps knowing who a man is and who a woman is, these ideas that were the bedrock of decency one moment, they became a hallmark of backwardness and reactionariness and perhaps even moral evil for another generation. A very fast change that left a lot of people humiliated and left a lot of people out of this system. And, also the reevaluation of, for instance, European history as no longer a narrative to be proud of, because you were part of a narrative that had lots of heroes and that was going in a positive direction. But now you were part of a narrative that meant that your wealth and your well-being were based on slavery and exploitation. Well, that also meant that, people were robbed of things that were dear to them. And perhaps a lot of what we regard as reactionary politics, as authoritarian politics, are also simply a backlash against this great revolution of ideas. But be it as it may, this has damaged our democracies. This has created discourse, perhaps necessarily so, in European societies, and these questions are still not resolved in European societies. All of these things are being made much, much worse by the fact that traditional media, which were to some extent tied to an idea of impartiality and decent research, are declining, and social media and, shall we say, uncontrolled media without gatekeepers are taking their place. And especially in the realm of digital media, of social media, there is no longer such a thing as a truth one can rely on. Everything could be fake. Everybody is getting different information, and it becomes very difficult to have a social or a society conversation when we are dependent on these media. And again, when I say that in the post-war era, there was so much change that it was difficult for people and for societies to absorb. This is not only going on, this is intensifying enormously. Simply the rate of technological transformation is far quicker than the rate of social transformation that our societies have. Only look at key technologies. I mean, social media are on the scene for about 15 years. Look how terribly important they've become. ChatGPT has been commercialized about 2 years ago. And again, huge impact, huge changes, and in such a fast time. And what's around the corner, we don't even know, but you can bet your bottom dollar that very soon the next great technological change is going to happen. All this makes for a very sobering outlook for Europe, because there seem to be insurmountable problems. Digitization, democracy, defense, demography, decarbonization, all these D words seem to haunt Europe and perhaps spell its end. But here I think there's a very important rider to consider. And that is that Europeans have become world champions at talking themselves down and of saying, well, we've got no power. What can we do? If the Americans, if the Chinese, Europeans, we don't have any teeth. We just have to, we're just the nice people with soft power and good opera houses. And if all these evil people do terrible things in the world, what can we do? This is a fantastic irony for the continent that was pretty much bossing around the world 100 years ago. And it is also simply not true. If you look at the numbers, never before have European countries been as wealthy, as still, in spite of everything, as unified, as well educated as they have been, as they are today. We have the technological solutions, we have the processes, we have the expertise to really have a go at these problems and to really change them. What we don't have an excuse is an excuse for not doing it. At the moment, we're finding ourselves in the wonderful position of saying, well, when Europeans exercised power in the past, it's always been a source of such evil and such violence, and we don't want to go back there. We just sit on our hands and wait that the Americans are doing the dirty work. We can feel slightly superior to them, but we don't have to do the dirty work of history. We don't have to elaborate a theory of power. That is for other people because we have already transcended that. No, we have not. This is the very point where Europe has to wake up and has to take up its historical responsibility and to see that, yes, indeed, European countries and societies are able to withstand these pressures, to tackle these problems, if they're only determined enough. They have the resources, they have the possibilities, they simply have to do it. Does Europe at the moment show this kind of political will? No, it does not. But is it impossible? No, of course it's not, because the die have not yet been cast. They certainly haven't yet fallen, and we can still have an influence on how our future develops. And this future, again, I think it's worth thinking in the long term and not being afraid of failing. It makes me think of a beautiful building plan, really, an architectural plan that is kept here in the Vienna Historical Museum. It is a plan for the North Tower of St. Stephen's Cathedral, and it was made in the 1400s, and it was drawn on vellum. It's 2 meters wide and 8 meters high, a huge drawing of the North Tower, the planned North Tower of St. Stephen's. And it is enormously detailed and very naturalistic. And the man who made it, the Vienna architect, building master who made it, he knew he would never see this tower built. The southern tower of the cathedral had already taken 300 years to build. And he also knew that his children and his grandchildren were unlikely to see this monument erected. He also knew that it cost enormous amount of money, that there would be workers who would fall to their deaths off the scaffolding, that there would be political strife, and the whole project would be called into question. But he still thought that it was worth investing his energies into this and to push this project on, because it was a project for the future of his society. And if there would be failures on the way, they would be perhaps also overcome. That, I think, is quite a strong idea. However, if you look at the North Tower of St. Stephen's today, you see it was never finished. That North Tower that was planned in the 1400s was never built like that. Why not? Because Vienna was attacked by the Turks. The money was needed somewhere else. Afterwards, style had moved on, fashion had moved on, and the tower was no longer built in this way. In fact, it was just finished off with a little roof. And that also shows you the future never quite works out as one thinks or wants it to work out, but that's no reason not to start on building it. And I think Europe is standing at a point where it's become absolutely paramount to begin this construction now, and to stop bickering, and to stop wondering, and to stop being slightly outraged that history is back and that Europe's lovely holiday from history is over. But Europe can have a future. It can be a democratic future, but there are huge obstacles to overcome. The only way to do that is to start now. So here's one rant. Thanks very much for listening. I hope I'll see you here again, or I will hear you here again. Do subscribe. Do tell people about the BlomCast. It is going on, and I would like to welcome more people into this community. And I also do leave comments. Do write to me. Tell me what you think of this. Tell me where I'm desperately wrong, or tell me where it's actually quite inspiring what you hear. Every contribution is welcome, and if I can, I promise I will answer you, and perhaps even plan another episode, find another interview partner according to your suggestions. For today, thanks for listening.